Capitalism. This is the Arabic edition. It's come out in quite a few other languages as well. Several English editions in India that included Indian authors, in Finnish, Russian, Chinese, and other languages as well. And the fundamental question to be addressed in this is the moral foundation of free market capitalism. Some people begin by denying that. They think, how can you have moral foundations for capitalism? They assume it inevitably is an immoral system, or it's not connected to morality at all. And I think that's fundamentally in error. There's a very deep and profound moral foundation to free market capitalism. But to be able to discuss that, we have to start with the question, what does it mean? What is capitalism? This has been addressed in a number of different ways. I think one of the most important scholars who looked at this was Joseph Schumpeter, who's an underappreciated great scholar and economist. And he looked at what he called that subspecies of all the systems based on private property. So that tells you private property is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for free market capitalism. And his focus was on novelty, on new systems, new combinations of factors of production that produce innovation. That was the fundamental characteristic. A recent study by Joyce Appleby from UCLA is called The Relentless Revolution, the study of capitalism. And it's a particularly interesting work because her focus is on the constant change that this brings about in market economy. Deirdre McCloskey, another economic historian whose work I highly recommend, has focused on what she calls private property and free labor without central planning, regulated by the rule of law and by ethical consensus. In her new book, she has a major new work on the economic history of the world from University of Chicago, and she talks about the age of innovation. It's what's characteristic of the modern age. So we're accustomed to thinking about free market capitalism as an economic system. But there's much more to it that needs to be understood. The first important element is that it is a legal system as well. It rests on a certain structure of rights, property rights. If you have something that I want, I cannot come and merely take it from you or hit you on the head. I have to offer you something in exchange for it. There's a respect for other people that characterizes this system. We understand much better now why the legal system is the foundation of free market capitalism. If you don't get that right, you will have a catastrophe. We realized with the collapse of socialism in USSR and other communist countries that they didn't have law in those countries. There effectively was no legal system. And to have a free market, you have to have a legal system. They didn't have one. So this, we learned, is one of the biggest challenges, to get the legal system correct. But there's another dimension that people often overlook, and that is, it is a cultural and a social system. It's a system that is open to innovations. We heard Professor Savila talking about the very important problems in this part of the world at one point for accepting change. The telegraph, the phonograph, and so on. Were they a challenge? Were they a threat to social stability? Were they against religion? And so on. That has changed. And now you have a society where people don't worry about sending a text message and whether this is acceptable or not. It's now part of the modern world. We accept this innovation and change regularly. It means a system in which people are free to seek their own fortune. And we have to understand how new this is in the world. For most of human history, people were born into a position. They lived like their parents lived. Their parents lived like their parents. And you knew from birth what you will be. We now live in a new world in which you can make your own future. Your birth, color, religion does not determine what you will be. And very importantly also your gender. This has been one of the really important changes. Now that there are no careers closed to people because of sex or gender. But it also means constant innovation. The innovation is decentralized. There's no ministry of innovation. That's a very important principle. This Apple computer, one of the more stylish examples of this, was developed by some young people in their garage. They started Apple Computer. Big companies often start in ways not with a giant foundation or through the state or through some rich person, but people experimenting with something. Often people who are very humble and modest. But we have a system to determine which innovations are helpful and which are harmful. In the market economy, we call it profit and loss. If you take two things that have opportunity cost of $1,000, you combine them. You can sell it for $1,200. You added at least $200 of value. You made the world more valuable. In fact, more, because there's what is called consumer surplus. The consumer valued it even more. On the other hand, loss is when you take something that you paid $1,000 for, combine it, you can only sell it for $700. You subtracted $300 of value from the world. And the market economy sends you this information. Don't do this anymore. You are destroying value. Profit, say, you're adding value. So we have a system to determine which innovations are valuable and which not. Now, the fundamental moral foundation of free market capitalism is this idea that every human being matters. Every person is unique and precious. There will never be another person just like you until the end of time. Every human being is unique, and everybody has their own life that they get to lead as they want. It's a very radical idea, and it's hard for many people to accept. Other people don't belong to me. That's a hard idea for people to grasp, because we want usually to control other people. But capitalism rests on the idea, you don't belong to me, and I don't belong to you. Each one can determine his or her own path. And that means a system in which we have property in our lives, in our freedom, and also property in the things that we enjoy. Computers, houses, tables, chairs, and so on. An efficient set of property needs a good legal system. Number one, we have in English the 3 Ds. Easy to remember. Definable, you have to define the property clearly. When you go to poor countries, you see the state fails right there. It's not clear what belongs to what person. So they fight all the time. Good property rights is definable. Second, defendable. You can defend your property rights in law, through the courts, and even against the state, which is often the most dangerous violator of rights. And then the last one, divestible. An old English word, it means transferable. You can transfer at low cost to other people to add value. And again, those are 3 common areas of state failure. The state does not define in poor countries, it does not defend, and it does not create a legal system to allow transactions. We need instead the rule of law and the idea of the presumption of liberty. This is a very important principle of a legal system based on liberty. It is presumed you have the freedom to do what you want, unless there is a reason to stop you. But the burden of proof is on the one who restricts freedom, not on the one who exercises it. Just as in criminal law, we do not say, you are charged with a crime, you must prove you are innocent. That's crazy. It's not possible. We say instead, the state must prove you are guilty. The burden is on the state. And similarly, the burden is on the state or others to restrict your freedom, not on you to justify it. Let's turn very quickly, and it's discussed in this book, the culture of capitalism. Entrepreneurship, innovation, and a culture based on adding value. That's really the key. That's what we do in the market economy. It's what real entrepreneurs do. To go back to Schumpeter, he describes a concept that's very important for understanding the modern world. Without it, you can't understand it. Creative destruction. that the market economy creates value, but it also destroys old ways of life. And part of modernity is being able to understand and accept this progress. As he put it in his book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, the problem that is usually being visualized is how capitalism administers existing structures, whereas the relevant problem is how it creates and destroys them. I'd like to give a simple example. When I was a boy, there was a career you studied for, and I thought about it. Maybe I'll do this. Typewriter repairman, to repair typewriters in offices. There were every place. There were stores, typewriter repair shop. If the typewriter was broken, we took to have it repaired. They don't exist anymore. When was the last time you saw a typewriter? Or a typewriter repair shop? Or a typewriter repairman? They're all gone. There are no more factories making typewriters. Now you see them only in museums. In fact, a friend of mine whose son is now 15, 10 years ago when he was 5, he came to his father and he said, "Daddy, come with me." I explained this. I saw a computer with no screen. He couldn't understand. It was a typewriter. It was completely foreign to him. So, free market capitalism eliminated industries and created new ones. It added value. My computer is much better than any typewriter I ever used. I could not watch movies on my typewriter. I could not talk to my friends on my typewriter, and so on. Many people, though, confuse two systems that need to be distinguished. And again, this is an important theme of this book. Free market capitalism or cronyism. And what we find, if you ask people who say, "I don't like capitalism," you ask them, "What do you not like?" Usually what they don't like is cronyism. And I don't like it either. It needs to be distinguished and rejected. The system in which you get favors from the state. If you're close to the rulers, you're close to the prime minister or the president, or whoever exercises power, you get subsidies, you get protection, you get benefits. And if you're not close, you're excluded. That kind of cronyism needs to be distinguished from free market capitalism. It is the opposite of it. I have an example I would have liked to show you of two Arab businessmen who went to the Americas. And they took two different paths. One is a man named Carlos Slim. He's probably the richest man in the world. He is a crony. He's an absolute crony from Lebanon. Went to Mexico, family there. He received the state monopoly on telephone. They privatized a monopoly. This is a bad idea. Now he spends his money to protect his monopoly. So there's very high telephone prices in Mexico. In contrast to other countries like Guatemala, the neighbor, they liberalized first, allowed competition. Then they privatized the state system. Very low telephone prices for everybody. Relatively open market. The other one I'd like to contrast is Salim Matar. Salim Matar, also Lebanese Arab businessman in Brazil. He created one of the biggest car rental companies in the world. It's a tremendous innovation. He is a real entrepreneur. He's not as rich as Carlos Slim, but he made every penny honestly in the market economy, not as a crony. We have two men, two paths, cronyism, harming consumers, or entrepreneurship and helping consumers and customers. Now I have a chart I would have put up on what free market capitalism has accomplished. And it's from Angus Madison, the Danish economic statistician. And if you look at per capita income around the world from the year 1 of the Common Era to the present, it's a flat line. Tiny up and down until about 1800, and then the curve goes almost vertical. And that represents the introduction of institutions of free market capitalism. Entrepreneurship, opening of the market, eliminating class distinctions, restrictions based on class and race and so on. An astonishing change in the lifestyle of average, everyday people. Most people here are probably, if you go back far enough, the descendants of slaves. All of us. From one time in the human past, our ancestors were enslaved. Now, let's almost totally disappeared. Only a few tiny places on the planet, shrinking elements of that. Soon it will be finished. It was destroyed by free market capitalism, which makes each one of us a free and independent person. There's a project I recommend looking at, freetheworld.com, from the Fraser Institute of Canada. They measure the degree of economic freedom or free market capitalism in every country of the world for which there are data. There are a couple where there's no data. Libya, for example, North Korea. But for all the majority, there is available data. And then they look at the consequences. And it is astonishing. The more free market capitalism, the higher the incomes of the average person, the longer they live. Every benefit you could imagine is positively correlated with the degree of free market capitalism. And we're talking about benefits available to the most poor and modest persons. They even found one thing quite interesting. We hear regularly, more free market capitalism leads to more inequality. Is it true or not true? It's an empirical question. They looked at the degree, at the share of income of the poorest 10% of the population all around the world. And they found something very interesting. It's about 2.5%, regardless of country, whether it's unfree, most free, or any place in between. It does not seem to vary with economic policy. But what does vary is the income of those people, varying in the poorest countries from $1,200 per year for the lowest quartile on average to $11,380 per year. What it means is, if you're going to be in that poorest 10%, it's much better to be poor in Switzerland than in Swaziland, in Africa. Better to be poor in Belgium than Burkina Faso. Because to be poor in Switzerland means you don't have an iPad, which is unfortunate. Not so nice when your friends have iPads. But to be poor in Swaziland is unbearable. You see your children die before your eyes. You suffer terrible illness and disease. You're hungry all the time. That's what it means to be poor in a country without freedom. In addition, there's a strong correlation between civil and political freedoms and economic freedom. This is a complicated relationship because it seems to go both ways. More civil and political freedom tends to lead to more economic freedom. But also, as in a case like South Korea, more economic freedom led to more civil and political freedom. It's a very complicated topic, and social scientists need to study this better. We find, though, that this package of freedom is positively correlated. And I'll conclude with two very quick thoughts. The first is from game theory, and then the second is from poetry. I think both are important to understanding these matters. People talk in game theory about different kinds of games. You've probably heard of zero-sum games. It means that the sum of the benefits equals zero. So let's say I go to Professor Tamaldu. He has a very beautiful watch. I don't. And I take his watch from him. He loses one watch. I gain the same watch. A negative watch and a positive watch equals zero. Or if it were money, I take from him 100 euros. I have 100. He has minus 100. Add them, zero. You hear that all the time. And that is how people think of economic exchange. The Professor Tamaldu benefits, someone lost. But in fact, that never happens. There are almost no zero-sum games ever observable. Instead, we find two different kinds of games. The first is called a negative-sum game. I go and against his desire, I take his watch from him. So he has lost his watch. I have the watch. But in the process, we fight. And the sum total of that is negative. Think about it. If you are robbed and behind a building, someone hits you, and stabs you, and they get out of your pocket 300 dirhams. The person has 300 dirhams. But what is your medical cost to go to hospital? 2,000 dirhams, let's say minimum, to go get bandages. The sum of minus 2,000 and plus 300 is minus 1,700. Games of stealing are negative sum games. But now there are also a different kind, positive sum games. And that is, I admire this watch very much. It is in fact a nice watch. I admire it. And I go to him and I say, what would induce Professor Kamal to give me the watch? And he might determine it would be a certain sum of money. He likes the watch also. So I give him the sum of money. He's happy and I'm happy. We have two pluses. It's a positive sum game. Those are the games that characterize free market capitalism, are consistently positive sum games, because it's a voluntary exchange. So what we have around us are no zero-sum games. They don't exist. We have the choice of negative sum games, in which we steal from other people. But we end up worse off in the aggregate. Society is poor. Or positive sum games, in which both of us benefit, and society is wealthier to that extent. I'll conclude then with a little poetry from a book by a great poet named Homer. Most American young people know about him because they think of Homer Simpson. There's a television show. But he was the Greek poet Homer, and he wrote two very important poems. The Iliad, which is a story about fighting. It's a story for teenage boys. It's about fighting, glory, and girls. It's a basic teenage boy story. And then the Odyssey, which is a story for grown-up adults. It's about Odysseus. After the war, he wants to go to his wife, Penelope. He yearns to go home to see his wife again, and she's waiting for him. In this process, he has many adventures. One of them, his ship is crashed on an island. The island of the Cyclops. One eye normally portrayed. The island of the Cyclops. And the Cyclops is not very nice. It was traditional in Greek society. If you land on my island, I give you water, I give you wine, I give you food, I help you, and you go your way. I might land on your island someday. There's reciprocity, we call it. And it was said that Zeus, the god, watches, is the god of strangers. If you're bad to a stranger, you will be punished by God. So you get a guest gift. Well, the Cyclops attacks his men and he eats that. Terrible. And Odysseus says, what is my guest gift? And the Cyclops says, I'll eat you last. This is not very good as a guest gift. It's quite unattractive. And then Homer asks, why is the Cyclops a savage? The answer was really interesting to me from an economic and moral perspective. It says, the Cyclops have no ships with crimson prows, as they would paint the front of the ship red. They have no ships. No shipwrights, no people who make ships, who could build them good, strong ships, that could sail them out to foreign ports of call, as most men risk the seas to trade with other men. The Cyclops is a savage because he does not trade. He lives in the ideal world of the anti-globalization movement. All the production and all the consumption is local. But the consequence is he's a savage. He does not see a person on his island as a friend, as a potential cooperator. He sees him as a snack, something that someone you would eat. It's trade that civilizes us, and free market capitalism that makes us into better people, more respectful of others. Well, I'll conclude with that. The book is available also in English, for those who prefer English, or French. There are French editions also. And you can find it online.